Hello, this is Dr. Mike again. Welcome to Chapter 2 of our discussion of developmental psychology. I hope that yesterday's lecture, you got some things out of it as far as context and things that we're talking about in this subject matter. And I think as you go forward, you're going to be more and more impressed with the details of what you will learn and what you'll take away from this course. As I said, this is one of the most vital courses that I ever took in my academic years, and I appreciate it. I still appreciate it. Still go back to it from time to time to think about it. I used it for 20 years as a pastor counseling because it helps you to understand, first of all, when you are talking to someone with a problem, number one, this is their span in their life. They're middle-aged, young, geriatric, pediatric, whatever. It helps you as a great starting point because now you have a concept of what they're going through and how they are developing. So we want to continue on with that frame today with Chapter 2, and hopefully we will be able to add some more flesh to the skeleton that we kind of started out with yesterday. So let me go to the slides and give us some direction here. And today we want to continue on and to talk about the biological foundations, heredity, prenatal development, birth. All those three, this is the first actual lifespan, if you will, the beginning. And there's some things about the biological foundations that I think will be vitally important to you. By the end of this chapter, you ought to be able to describe human chromosomes, genetic disorders, as well as interactions between heredity and environment. You ought to be able to describe the periods, the process of birth from zygote to embryo to fetus, and describe how general risk factors affect prenatal development, and describe the 3 stages of childbirth, child complications, and infant mortality. Those are all very, very real things if you're in the nursing field or the medical fields that you will come up against on a regular basis. And so it's good as you read the materials. My lectures are designed not to be all-inclusive and give you every detail, but to give you a superstructure that when you go to read the chapters, you will have some idea of what's there. And I think that will be very, very helpful to you. First of all, we're going to talk about the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Every human being has the same number of chromosomes. And this is what distinguishes us from other organisms on the planet. We have close relatives that have very close to that number, but they don't have that number. So to be human means that you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, the key questions we want to look at in this chapter are, what are chromosomes and genes, and how do they carry hereditary information from one generation to the next? That's important. What are common problems involving chromosomes, and what are their consequences? How is children's heredity influenced by the environment in which they grow up in? So these 3 questions will be kind of the center of our thinking today. When we talk about heredity, of course, we're talking about the things that get passed down from generation to generation. You will see a lot of newspaper recently where they talk about the fact that they found human beings that still had some of the heredity, some of the chromosomes, some of the genetic materials of the Neanderthal, which is one of the we would call them cavemen in the past. And so, excuse me, that's quite interesting. But chromosomes are the mechanisms. We have been able in the past decade to map out the entire human genome. So we know every chromosome, every gene, what those pieces do to create the human beings that we are. So human eggs, the human egg contains 23 chromosomes selected from the female parents, and there are 46, and the human sperm contains 23 chromosomes selected from the male parents, 46. So it's kind of a roulette wheel, if you will, as to what you get from your 2 parents. Think of it as mixing 2 hands of cards, one from the mother, one from the father, shuffling the mix and then dealing a hand of cards. And the dealt hand happens to be your 23 pairs of chromosomes. So those are going to be the things that are going to be carried into your next generation. So the human egg and the human sperm unite and result in what we call the zygote that contains a complete set of 23 paired chromosomes, 46 in total. The 46 chromosomes contain about 25,000 genes, and those genes contain the information that will make up what you become. Autosomes are the first 22 pairs, and then the 23rd pair would be the sex chromosome, and the 23rd pair determines the child's sex at birth, and then the male would be an XY. You would always get an X from your mother, but you could get an X or a Y from your father. If you get the Y chromosome from your father, you would be a male. If you got the X from your father, it means you'd be double X, and so you'd be a female. Now, we all know that in recent days, we've become more aware of some divergence in this area, and I'm not going to discuss that in this class, but there are some unusual things that come up in this area that make for a lot of very heated discussions today. But so the genotype, when we say that, use that word, we are discussing the genes that you've inherited. The phenotype is a combination of the genotype and the environmental influences that result in the expression of that trait. So just because you have the genes, if you don't take into effect the environmental influences, doesn't mean you're going to express everything that you receive. There are physical restraints, there are behavioral, there are psychological things that go along with that help in that process of you becoming not just a concoction of your genes, but behavior and all kind of influences outside of that. The interaction of genes on each pair of chromosomes will produce traits. Now, when I talk about traits, I'm talking about things like hair color, skin color, whether your earlobe is attached or unattached is a hereditary trait. It's something that's passed down. The color of your eyes, shape of your nose, shape of your lips, your facial features, but all of these things are interacting at the gene level on the chromosomes. Alleles form a different form in which the gene comes. Each allele, which is part of the gene, carries instructions for a specific variation in a trait. When we talk about homogeneous alleles, these alleles are the same. Both parents have contributed similar genes for a trait. For example, they would do that, they contribute the same gene for eye color. If it's heterogeneous, the parents have contributed different versions of the trait. And for example, one parent would contribute the allele for blue eyes and another for brown eyes. And so then you have possibilities of how that could be expressed. It is possible. Long before genetics was understood, there are probably more divorces over this issue than any other one issue, how two black-haired parents or a black and a brown-haired parent could have a redheaded child. And of course, the suspicion of the husband was that his wife was having a baby and cheated on him. That is now shown to be absolutely possible because of dominant and recessive traits that we carry in our gene pool. So in this example, we have a single gene inheritance here. We have a father and a mother, and they would both give the A, say, for sickle cell trait. Both would contribute the double A or the small a there, or there would be, so they could have four different genetic type children. They could have one that would be totally normal, so they would both receive the double A. They could have a sickle cell trait of two of them, and then the third one would be the weakest sickle cell trait. So three of their four children could have the gene for sickle cell anemia, and probably the one would be actually have the disease. So there's all kind of different ways that our genetic code can randomly shuffle things to make up what we know. There are lots of inherited disorders that come like that, often with two recessive traits, the little A's as we saw there. An example would be sickle cell anemia, which occurs most often in African Americans. PKU, and some of those will have a dominant trait and some recessive. Another would be like Huntington's disease. There are abnormal chromosomes sometimes. They have extra, or they have missing, or they have damaged chromosomes that result in abnormal development. Things like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome are all examples of that. Something happened with the chromosomes, they're damaged, they're missing, they're extra. And this can go on all the time. You could actually have mutations caused by radiation, caused by any number of factors that can cause these things to happen. Sometimes in locations, say, where there's tainted water and people drink that during pregnancy, that will cause an abnormal thing to happen in the genes. There are behavioral genetics that are important because studies the inheritance of behavioral or psychological traits. These are really complex because most of the traits are the results of a lot of different genes or allele pairs. They're not the result of only one gene or one allele. So if there's something going on with them, it's not just one small problem. It's a more complicated situation. There can be polygenetic inheritance when genes affect the phenotype of a physical, psychological, behavioral trait. It gets strongly expressed with more alleles that are dominant in the combination and weakly expressed in those that are recessive. So you can have a double small a or a double capital A in those traits and get two dominant genes for a trait or two recessives, and they will cause certain genetic problems that happen in a child. A digazotic or fraternal twin. Now, we can have different kinds of twins, of course. Fraternal twins happen when there are two different eggs fertilized by two different sperm. They are not any more genetically similar than any other sibling. So they are not twins as such. They're two separate babies that are conceived at the same time and carried to term in the same womb, but don't have exactly the same genetic makeup. In a monozygotic or identical twin, they result from the union of one egg and one sperm that splits into two sometime after conception, and they are genetically identical. Either type of twin may share much of the same experience, much of the same environment, so they make for some pretty interesting studies for the psychology. Scientists compare identical and fraternal twins to measure the influence of heredity, and that's a really important study. So how do we get from genes to behavior? That's what we want to talk about in a lifespan course. Heredity and environment will interact very dynamically through development. You'll have heritable coefficients that get shared. Genes can influence the kind of environment to which a person's exposed. And then environmental influences typically make children within a family different. So they have, they may share the same environment, come out with different results. And then you have non-shared environmental influences. All these things go into making a child into the person that it becomes. And this is quite interesting because there's so many factors here. It's rather complicated, and I know you detect that already. But as you read the text, the materials, hopefully it'll fill in some of the questions that you have, and I'm more than happy to answer any that you might come up with. So when we think about pairs, genotypes, phenotypes, environment, shared activity. With a partner, identity of each of the following is either a phenotype or a genotype or environmentally determined. And some might be more than one. When we think about eye color or height or autosomes or your vocabulary or your heterozygous recessive alleles. Take height, for instance. Height is a big deal when it comes to environment, comes to diet. And it was a long time before, when Europeans first came to America, before the environment began to change the physical characteristics of a person. So that today Americans are generally taller than other white Europeans or whatever. Or I just came back from a month in the Philippines, and Filipinos are very, very short. but you're beginning to see some height come out of that from different foods and eating different things. So there's a lot of things that determine in the end what your eye color or height can be. In fact, my grandfather had one brown eye and one blue eye. So that was rather unusual. So looking from conception to birth, we have a few things we want to talk about here that are important and some key things. What happens to a fertilized egg in the first 2 weeks after conception? When do body structures, internal organs emerge in the prenatal development? And when do body systems begin to function well enough to support life? Those are all pretty important questions when we're talking about birth. So prenatal development takes on average 38 weeks, time measured from the date of conception, which we probably never know exactly. But conception typically occurs about 2 weeks after the pregnant parent's last menstrual period. Okay, it's divided into 3 periods. There's a period we call the zygote, which is weeks 1 and 2. And then when it attaches to the, it moves from being a zygote and attaches to the uterine wall, it's weeks 3 through 8. And then the fetus, once it becomes a fetus and begins to take on the appearance of a human, then it's from weeks 9 through 38. So these are important kind of marking points to know. So the zygote, which is week 1 and 2, after fertilization, and that today can be natural or it can be in vitro, which means that it's done outside the womb. The zygote travels down the fallopian tubes and is implanted in the uterine wall. That implantation triggers hormonal changes that stops menstruation and begins to bathe the embryo with hormones that will trigger those cells that are rapidly dividing and cause them to specialize at some point. So cells, starting with 1 cell and 1 sperm, develops into billions of cells, and cells develop into a baby. Other cells form the placenta, which kind of supports the baby's development. Those are they're blank cells, if you will, that are used in the growth process. So there's a lot of stuff going on in these first 2 weeks that you don't even realize if you're pregnant. You do realize some things, but you don't have any idea of the nature of this process. So this diagram kind of shows you this movement and the time frames. I'm not going to read all of these, but it takes you through that 2 weeks to show you the process and how important that is. So the periods of prenatal development, again, we talk about then the embryo. First was the zygote, now the embryo. This is from week 3 to week 8. And you start having body structures develop, internal organs, and the 3 layers of the embryo develop. This is important. The ectoderm, which is the outer layer, which will turn into skin, hair, and nervous system. The mesoderm, which is the middle layer, becomes the muscles, the bones, the circulatory system. And the endoderm, which is the inner layer, becomes digestive system and lungs. How does it know what to become what? The hormones have all these blank cells that are formed that are just like blanks in a gun. Actually, they're not purposed. And these hormones will turn on and turn off difference of these cells. Turn on a cell to become part of the nose, turn on a cell to become part of the ear, turn on the cell to become part of the eye color. All those things is highly regulated in this process. There's also an amniotic sac that surrounds the new embryo. It is filled with fluid. There's an umbilical cord that will connect the embryo to the placenta, to the mother, and this is how waste is removed and nutrients are brought in for the baby to live. Anything that the mother puts in her body at this stage will be shared with the baby. So a baby, say a mother's on crack or on some other drug, that drug gets transferred. She's an alcoholic. The alcohol gets transferred. So we have babies today that are born already an addict before they even get into the world, or they're already an alcoholic almost. It allows the exchange of nutrients, also of oxygen, because the baby has to have oxygen in order to live, vitamins, and then waste products between the mother and the embryo. And again, I say that whatever goes into if the mother doesn't go for like her prenatal checks, be sure everything's all right. That's a bad move because you don't know what's going on. You can't see, and those checks help to be sure everything's going on normally. In a system that is this complicated, it is really important that those checks be made and that the mother is careful about what she puts into her body. Smoking, drinking, drugs, all those things will have a very negative effect on the life of an embryo and may cause it to be not survive the process, or be born addicted, or be born with any other kind of congenital issues. So the growth of the embryo follows two important principles. The cephalocaudal principle is where the head develops before the rest of the body. So the brain and the head are becoming in the first place, and the proximodistal principle grows the parts near the center of the body, and then finally the most distant. So you're going to see head first taking shape and being recognizable, and then the center organs, and finally the arms and legs will become visible. So the fetus stage, which is from 9 weeks, so we've gone from zygote to embryo, and now we are at the fetus. It begins at 9 weeks, ends at the actual birth. The fetus becomes much larger, and the body systems start to function, and they're going to finalize and develop and fine-tune through all this time. Final development of many systems that are essential to human life will start here. All the regions of the brain will start to grow, particularly the cerebral cortex. And then week 9, you'll have the differentiation between ovaries and testes, which determine the actual sex organs of the child. Now, you realize that there are at any stage here any number of things that might go awry. That will happen in this process. It is a very complicated process and is very dependent on lots of things. Some of those things the mother can do, and the other things are just beyond her control. But it's important to realize that this is a very complicated, childbirth is a very complicated process. It is not something you undertake alone. And yet you think about excuse me, the number of people in the world that give birth every day without a doctor, without a nurse, with a midwife or whatever. And that was done forever. Even in America, probably before 1960s, many babies were born with a midwife. The problem is if there is a complication, then you don't have the facilities there to back up or to take care. So in week 12, we have circulatory system begins to function, and week 16, mother will begin to feel the baby moving. 20, you'll start getting eyebrows, eyelashes, scalp hair. The skin thickens, covered with this protective greasy substance called the vernix, because remember, the baby's moving, and anytime there is friction, then there could be the possibility of chafing or even in the womb. So that's part of that process. Weeks 22 to 28, age of viability. At this stage, the baby really comes to life. And then week 22 and beyond, senses are active. A baby can move. It goes through the grasping process, even reflect. It will respond to light in the womb or to an intrusion. Sometimes the doctor will do an amniocentesis to check on things, and the baby will actually physically draw back from the needle. But that fetus can remember voices. It can remember music. It can remember taste. So lots of mothers in their pregnancy will play, not rock music, not something bodacious or loud, but classical music, use something soft and soothing. And the baby will respond to both mother and father. So they talk to the baby a lot. You've seen pictures, if you haven't done it, you've seen pictures of them sitting and talking to their child before it's born, because the baby at this stage can hear voices and can understand. That fighting and arguing and cursing and fussing and all those things do have a detrimental effect on the baby in the womb at this particular period of time. So there's a lot of influences on prenatal development, and I want to just mention those to you that you need to look at. Teratogens or drugs, diseases, environmental hazards can cause abnormal prenatal development. Things, as we've said, about like drugs, sorry, got off line here. Drugs have a marked effect on a baby's outcomes. Alcohol, aspirin, caffeine, even, or nicotine, of course. Caffeine is a drug, even though so you can't drink a whole lot of coffee. There are babies born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or syndrome, which means they're already addicted to the alcohol when they're born. And nicotine increases the likelihood of miscarriage, low birth weight, birth defects. And so it's important that a mother not smoke during that time. Diseases like AIDS, all kinds of viruses, genital herpes, rubella, German measles, syphilis, all those things can affect the baby. And sometimes they will affect the baby directly through the placenta and will attack the fetus during birth. There are medications that may help to treat a woman after she becomes ill, but yet not prevent damage to the baby, which is really difficult. Okay. Environmental hazards, air pollution, lead, PCBs, X-rays, living in houses where they have lead paint on the wall could be a worry. Exposing the fetus to environmental hazards like polluted air, lead, all these things can affect physical and mental development of the fetus before birth and of the child after birth. It can also lead to the child developing health issues like leukemia after birth. So anything like this is really, really serious. So how do these drugs and different things affect the baby? It really can, the effect can depend upon the genotype. The impact changes over the course of prenatal development, and each tetragen affects some specific area of natal development. So one thing may affect the brain, one thing may affect the lungs or the liver, whatever. But the impact of tetragens depends on the dosage, how much a child gets, and the damage is not always evident at birth, but may develop afterwards. So when you think about tetragens, think about the consequences of each of the following during prenatal: the consequences of alcohol or nicotine or lead or rubella. Rubella, of course, is measles. You want to be very careful not to get any kind of diseases like that during pregnancy because it's really hard. Prenatal diagnosis and treatment. There's all kind of genetic counseling available, all kind of diagnosis that we have now, and fetal therapy. So it's really important that a mother goes to her appointments and does the prenatal screenings and all those things in case, and like there's a lot of things can be prevented. So we get to labor and delivery, and these are all really important. Stage 1 would be 12 to 24 hours before birth. You have contractions that become more regular and stronger and more rhythmic. The cervix enlarges up to 10 centimeters, and that's all stage 1. So, if you go into the hospital early, they'll say, well, you're at stage 1, they'll send you home probably. Stage 2, the baby begins to pass through the cervix to the vagina, and then the baby's head appears, which is called crowning, and that is actual birth. And then stage 3, minutes after the birth, the placenta is expelled. The placenta is an interesting organism because it is all of the blank cells that have not been used in forming the baby. It's important because there's a lot of interest in research on taking these blank cells and being able to turn them on to produce a liver or a heart or some organ. If you could have your own way of making a different heart, you had to have a heart, you could make one from these placenta cells, which are blank, then you would not have the rejection you have when you take a regular transplant, which means you have to take that medication all of your life to keep from your body rejecting your organ. Okay, so then we get to childbirth. Preparation's important. Going to classes and learning relaxation and coaching techniques helps. 1% of births are at home still, which is quite interesting. But that's probably worldwide, that's probably much higher than that. So how do you get used to parenthood? Those of you that have been through that, you realize that there's a big deal. It takes some time, right? 1 to 2 weeks. You go, about half the parents go through irritation, they go through resentment, they go through crying. This is the mother reflecting stress and physiological changes. This is a tremendous change to a woman's body. Think about 9 months of taking vitamins and minerals and everything that you've got stored in your body. That baby's taking it from you. And so, vitamin deficiencies kick in. There is postpartum depression, and that's a big deal. There's a lot of mothers end up doing suicide during that time. Don't ever, if you haven't been there, and you don't ever put that off as not being of some consequence. It is always, depression is always serious. It is always necessary. Go get help, get counseling, get meds or whatever. But don't just ignore that if you're a woman that is experiencing that. Months after the birth, 10 to 15% will experience postpartum depression. As I said, that may affect the baby. You feel less low self-worth, irritability, disturbed sleep, poor appetite, apathy, not wanting to do anything. The risk factors that accompany that are high hormonal levels, pre-pregnancy depression, stress, lack of support. Breastfeeding reduces the risk somewhat, interestingly enough. It's amazing how many women give birth to babies and come into the world that they don't have proper support. There's a lot of single parents in the world. And so some of you have walked in those shoes, you know what it's like to be without support. There are some birth complications that we need to note. Hypoxia comes from the inadequate blood and oxygen to the baby. And so sometimes we have to do cesarean section to remove the baby artificially. And there's a lot of premature preterm births. That's before week 36. Low birth weight is always a big problem. Babies have to be put in incubators. Very low birth weight, if it's less than 3.3 pounds, then it's very low, and extremely low, 2.2 pounds. So there are some babies that are born very, very small. Infant mortality rate is the percentage of infants who die before the age of 1 year old. U.S. mortality rate is 5 infants out of 1,000. So we are, where are we? We're close to the bottom. And 26 industrialized nations have lower infant mortality than the United States. That's all these here. The worst places to live would be Russia, or worse than us, China, Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa. India has the worst. They have like 33 per 1,000. So there's a lot of factors. Low birth weight due to lack of free or inexpensive prenatal care. And there again, it's another reason to do your best to get prenatal care. There are free places to get that. Fewer paid leave of absence. So women have to work longer in order before they can get their maternity leave. And then that may not be very long. So it's quite interesting. So 26 industrialized nations have lower infant mortality than the United States. And you ought to look at what contributes to that statistic. And then, of course, you think about this. So this gets us up to the birth phase. And so you think about human chromosomes, genetic disorders, interactions between heredity and environment, and then be sure you know the 3 periods of the baby in pre-birth, and then the risk factors and the 3 stages of childbirth and birth complications and infant mortality. So I think that this gives you a pretty good summary. When you read the text, I encourage you to read chapter 2 to fill in the details. So again, we're just giving you a skeleton here, and then we want you to read to add to your knowledge. You'll be adding to your knowledge the rest of your life. You're going to be learning new things and taking in new things, and this is just a part of that. You understand when you go to school, you're going to read, you're going to be writing. So, you cannot just slough that off and get a good education. And that's a really important thing. Okay, I will see you when we talk about chapter 3 tomorrow, and get on with your work, and don't wait till Sunday night, because Sunday night will kill you if you think you're going to try to get all this stuff done by the deadline on Sunday night. And we don't have that many. 6 weeks is not long. So you want to be sure you keep up with your work. And if you have any problems, please let me know. Until then, thank you.